Miami is the financial capital of Latin America. Not Sao Paulo, not Mexico City. Miami, a city of 6 million people in South Florida, home to 1,400 multinational headquarters, $1 trillion in Latin American private wealth, and the busiest cruise port on Earth. It's also built on a slab of porous limestone that averages just 6 feet above sea level. There's no bedrock under Miami, no navigable rivers, no natural harbor deep enough for ships. The only freshwater source is an underground aquifer sitting directly on top of rock that seawater moves through like a sponge. The entire southern end of the state was, until about 100 years ago, a subtropical wetland that flooded for half the year. How does a global capital get built on that? Because Miami's success has almost nothing to do with the geography that should have made it fail. And that's exactly what made its future so uncertain. In 1890, the population of what is now Miami-Dade County was fewer than 900 people. The geography of South Florida gave settlers almost nothing to work with. The land was flat and wet. The summer heat was brutal, and the mosquitoes were legendary. Yellow fever and malaria moved through the region regularly. The soil was thin limestone covered by a few inches of organic matter. Useful for growing some citrus, not much else. And unlike the rest of the American coastline, there was no natural harbor. Biscayne Bay was too shallow for the cargo vessels that turned other coastal cities into commercial centers. Galveston and Charleston had harbors. New Orleans sat at the mouth of the continent's largest river system. Miami had a bay that needed dredging before a single freight ship could dock. The city exists because of one woman and one man who had almost nothing to do with geography. Julia Tuttle owned 640 acres along the Miami River. Henry Flagler owned the Florida East Coast Railway. In 1894, a freeze destroyed the citrus crops of northern Florida, while Tuttle's Miami Grove survived. She sent Flagler orange blossoms as proof. He extended his railroad 366 miles south to a terminus that had no economic reason to exist yet. Miami incorporated in 1896 with 300 registered voters. The vote was 33-1 in favor. The geography said no. The railroad said yes anyway. For the first half of the 20th century, Miami was a resort town, a winter escape for wealthy northerners. The geography that made it inhospitable to settlement made it appealing to visitors. Warm, flat, beach adjacent. The city grew, but it grew as a seasonal destination, not a serious economic center. Then, on January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro rode into Havana. What happened next is the most important event in Miami's economic history, and it had nothing to do with Miami's decisions. The Cuban professional class, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and business owners, fled the island. The nearest American city was 90 miles away. They came in waves. First, the wealthy, then the middle class. Then, the 1980 Mariel boat lift brought more than 125,000 people in 5 months. By 1970, Cubans had rebuilt an entire business ecosystem in Miami. Banks, law firms, import-export companies, Spanish-language media. By 1980, Miami had become the only major American city where you could conduct an entire professional life in Spanish. That was an economic asset that no other U.S. city could replicate. Colombian drug money followed in the late 1970s. It was destructive, but it also brought banking connections and trade networks that stayed long after the violence was contained. Venezuelan capital flight arrived in the 1990s and accelerated under Hugo Chavez. Nicaraguan exile communities, Brazilian financial firms, Argentine families hedging against peso collapse. Each wave made Miami more indispensable to the next one. The geography that should have disqualified Miami, its position at the far southern tip of the United States, cut off from the American interior by the Everglades, turned out to be the one feature that mattered. Miami was close to the Caribbean, close to Central America, closer to Bogota than to Chicago. Close enough to be the obvious landing point every time a Latin American country went through a crisis, which they did with some regularity. Miami didn't compete for this. It was inherited by proximity, one crisis at a time. But all of that success sits on top of a problem most cities never have to think about. To understand Miami, you have to look underground. To build Miami, engineers had to drain it. The Everglades once covered most of South Florida, roughly 4,000 square miles of slow-moving freshwater wetland flowing south from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay. In 1905, Florida Governor Napoleon Broward ran for office on a platform of draining the Everglades. Canals were dug, levees were built. The water that had covered the land for thousands of years was redirected to the ocean. It worked. By mid-century, South Florida had dry land where there had been marsh and developers built on it. The problem is what happens underground. Miami sits on the Biscayne Aquifer, a shallow, porous limestone formation that is the only freshwater source for 2.4 million people in Miami-Dade and Broward counties. It's not deep. In some places, it sits less than 10 feet below the surface. The limestone is riddled with holes. Water moves through it in every direction, including sideways. That matters because the ocean is right there. As sea levels rise, salt water pushes inland through the limestone. Not over the top, but through the rock itself. Miami can build seawalls. It can't seal the ground. The saltwater intrusion front in Miami-Dade has moved more than a mile inland since the 1970s. The county's water utility has been relocating its well fields westward for decades, retreating away from the coast toward the remaining Everglades. At some point, the Everglades and the saltwater front meet. There's also no bedrock. The same loose limestone that lets water move freely through it can't support the kind of deep foundation infrastructure that other coastal cities use to anchor flood barriers. New York built a seawall system. Houston built levees. Miami's geology makes a comprehensive barrier impractical. The water goes around and under, not just over. Miami Beach floods on sunny days now, not during storms, during high tides. Streets in the South Beach neighborhood that have been above water for a century go underwater several times a year with no rain and no wind. The city has spent $600 million raising roads, installing pump stations, and elevating infrastructure. The pumps run continuously, and the flooding still comes. The insurance market has noticed. Several major insurers have stopped writing new homeowner policies in Florida. The carriers that remain have raised premiums until Miami-Dade now has the highest average homeowner insurance costs in the continental US, more than 3 times the national average in many zip codes. A $500,000 home in Miami Beach can carry insurance costs that would cover a mortgage payment in most of the country. In 2020, Miami-Dade passed the Miami Forever Bond, $400 million for sea level rise adaptation. The number sounds large. The Army Corps of Engineers put the full cost of protecting South Florida at somewhere between $4 billion and $6 billion. That assumes the rate of rise stays within current projections. Parts of Miami Beach are also subsiding. That means the ground is compressing slowly as the weight of buildings sits on soft sediment and porous rock. In some areas, the subsidence is measurable in inches per decade. Not fast, but in a place where a foot of elevation is the difference between a dry street and a flooded one, inches matter. Here's the problem with all of this. None of it is enough to make people leave. Miami's population has grown every decade since 1900. After Hurricane Andrew in 1992, a Category 5 storm that destroyed 125,000 homes, the county's population grew by 200,000 in the following decade. After years of escalating insurance costs and increasingly frequent tidal flooding, Miami remains one of the fastest growing metro areas in the United States. The economic argument for staying isn't irrational. The Port of Miami generates $17 billion in annual economic activity and supports 200,000 jobs. Miami International Airport is the top U.S. gateway to Latin America and the Caribbean. The financial services sector manages assets that have no obvious alternative home. The relationships, the legal infrastructure, the bilingual professional class that took 60 years to build can't be relocated to Tampa or Atlanta or anywhere else in the United States. $1 trillion in Latin American private wealth is here because Miami is here. If Miami weren't here, that wealth would be in Zurich or Madrid or Panama City. It's not here because of the geography, it's here because of the history. The Cuban exiled community that built the first institutions, the Venezuelan capital flight that followed, the decades of accumulated trust and legal precedent and professional networks. That's the thing about Miami that makes it different from every other city facing geographic pressure. Houston's value is in its infrastructure, pipes, refineries, port facilities, which are physical and expensive to move, but theoretically relocatable. Miami's value is in its relationships, which are not. You can't pick up $1 trillion in Latin American trust and put it somewhere else. And that's why Miami is different. Most cities become valuable because of their geography. Miami became valuable despite it. Go back to that limestone slab. 6 feet above sea level. No bedrock, no natural harbor. 900 people in 1890. A railroad changed that. A revolution changed it again. Then another and another. Each political crisis in Latin America sending another wave of capital and expertise and ambition to the one American city close enough and stable enough to receive it. The geography got outbid, repeatedly, by history. Miami is now the most expensive real estate market in the American South, and the most geologically vulnerable major city in the United States. Both of those things are true because of the same decision: to build a global capital on land that had no business hosting one. The city that geography said shouldn't exist has become the city the Western Hemisphere can't afford to lose. Miami didn't overcome its geography. It ignored it long enough to become irreplaceable. The question now is whether irreplaceable is the same as safe. If you want to understand how Houston built a similar bet against its own geography, and what happened when the bill came due, that video is linked here. The world has a structure. Let's keep finding it.